What might surprise you about the impact of alcohol on heart disease? How can wine drinkers reduce the risk of certain cancers with just one supplement? Does wine help protect against cognitive decline and dementia? And why do some organizations make extreme recommendations for eliminating alcohol? In today's episode, you'll hear the stories and tips that answer those questions in part 2 of our chat with Tony Edwards. You don't need to have listened to part 1 from last week first, but if you missed it, go back and have a listen after you finish this one. By the end of our conversation, you'll also discover what the Mayo Clinic found out about the relationship between women and red wine, how the concept of absolute risk versus relative risk contributes to those clickbait scary headlines, why wine plays such an important part in the longevity puzzle for certain populations, the surprising relationship between wine consumption and inflammation, why Tony believes the World Health Organization's 2023 declaration that no level of alcohol consumption is safe is rooted in an anti-alcohol agenda rather than in scientific evidence, what's happening with alcohol labeling legislation in Ireland and how that might spread to other countries, and the problems with the controversial drinking guidelines proposed in Canada. Okay, let's get started. Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my 3rd book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 310. I think today's episode, along with part 1 from last week, are the most important topics we've covered in this podcast. There's just so much confusion about wine and health. As I mentioned previously, a number of the scariest headlines and recommendations are based on an ideology of zero tolerance for alcohol with a dogmatic bias on how we should live and behave rather than being based strictly on the science. The data is really easy to misconstrue, and the most dire relative statistics, rather than the nothing burger absolute statistics, are catnip for some media. Even though many studies associate moderate drinking with greater lifespan and health span, I'm willing to make the adult decision based on sound science that I'd happily make the trade-off between drinking moderately throughout my life and shortening my life for a few days, which is what one of the studies cherry-picked to slant the findings negatively showed. Trust me with the full details. I'm all grown up now. This is also unnecessarily causing moderate drinkers to cut back or quit wine and forgo its health benefits, as well as the communal aspects of wine when we're in the middle of a loneliness epidemic post-pandemic. Gen Z drinks less than previous generations, and that group is most susceptible to changing their habits with new guidelines. I'm not advocating for everyone to drink wine, but I believe that the decision should be based on solid evidence rather than misleading studies. The second big risk from these misleading studies is that people start ignoring public health advice altogether or give up trying to drink moderately. If no amount is good for you, why bother to stay moderate? May as well drink the whole bottle rather than saving some for another day. And that's just not true. Finally, if government research agencies believe these misleading headlines that no amount of alcohol is safe, why bother funding any new research? It's a toxin, full stop. But it's not. We'll never discover nuances like it's the combination of polyphenols interacting with each other and with alcohol rather than resveratrol alone that gives the heart health benefits. We'll never know if certain lifestyle factors in combination with moderate drinking lead to other health benefits. I tried to dig in as deeply as I could with Tony, especially on the aspects that affect most of us, such as heart disease, cancer, and cognitive decline. But there were more areas that we did not have time to discuss, and that's why I encourage you to buy a copy of Tony's new book, The Very Good News About Wine. 3 of you will also win a copy of the book. There haven't been any takers yet from last week's episode, and I also still have 1 copy of Gus Zhu's new book, Behind the Glass, The Chemical and Sensorial Terroir of Wine Tasting. Susan Berkowitz from New York City has won the other copy of Gus's fantastic book. All you have to do is email me and let me know you'd like to win. I'll choose 4 people randomly from those who contact me. If you haven't won a book yet, now's your chance, and keep listening, as my goal is to offer lots more books and other prizes with every episode. Just email me at natalie@nataliemaclean.com. In other book news, if you're reading the paperback or ebook of Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much, or listening to the audiobook, I'd love to hear from you at natalie@nataliemaclean.com. I'll put a link in the show notes to all retailers worldwide at nataliemaclean.com/310. Okay, on with the show. What positive health effects were buried in the Harvard and/or Cambridge studies?
On heart disease.
On heart disease, yes.
Harvard has been a very, very big centre of research since the 1970s, 80s. They were the first people to do some research in a town called Framingham in Massachusetts. Now, Framingham was where they started just after the Second World War to recruit all of the population of this little town and study their medical records in detail. And it's a long-term project. It's still going on now, 50 years later. It was a government project. The government said to them, OK, we were interested in heart disease. It's been going for a few years now. This is about the 1950s. Go and see what's happening with heart disease. OK, they said, hopped off of Framingham, looked at all of the data, and they were astonished. They came back and said, well, Mr. Government, NIH presumably, what we found very, very clearly is that people who drink alcohol, any kind of alcohol, have less heart disease. The NIH went into a fury and said, you're not thinking of publishing this, are you? I said, of course we are. We forbid it. You will not publish this. Yeah. And they said, if you do publish it, just say alcohol has no effect. So the Harvard people kept their cool and said, well, we're not publishing. They waited for all the people at NIH to leave or be fired or whatever, and then they finally published it about 10 years later. So Harvard's been a great centre for this research into heart disease, and I think they've done a lot of work since. And they were one of the first people to show, also British people did, that actually heart disease is reduced significantly by.
Was it by 25%? A reduced risk of 25% in that one?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Wow.
All alcohols, not just wine, but in wine it's actually even better, as you'd expect.
How much better? Or
the J curve
is more pronounced.
Yeah, no, less pronounced.
Oh, it goes further out. Like you can drink more before you get into trouble. Yeah, okay. Right. Okay, gotcha. Yes. Okay. Wow. Now, the idea, I think, in your book that wine might be better than many vitamin supplements is striking. How does wine's nutrient composition give it such a health advantage over synthetic supplements or vitamins we take from the drugstore?
I mean, I'm not sure that I might slightly have exaggerated that.
Or maybe I am. But
polyphenols packed together in wine have this huge punch, which I suspect is stronger than a punch of a multivitamin supplement.
I might have phrased that in such a way to exaggerate it, but let's move on to cancer, because that's an important one. We touched on breast cancer, but again, you note that wine consumption can increase the risk of certain cancers, of course, mouth, throat, esophagus, which makes sense given that these areas are most directly exposed to unprocessed alcohol that our liver hasn't dealt with. As well, cancer risk escalates dramatically when alcohol is combined with smoking. More than 4,000 chemicals have been identified in cigarette smoke. About 250 of them are known health hazards, and more than 50 are carcinogens. Cigarette smoke also contains highly reactive free radicals, which promote reactive oxygen species. Tobacco smoke interacts with our oral bacteria, turning alcohol into the carcinogen acetaldehyde.
acetaldehyde.
There you go. Thank you. Interestingly, though, you note that wine also kills plaque in the mouth. You also write that wine can actually decrease the risks of certain cancers, such as kidney, thyroid, and blood cancers like leukemia. How does it decrease, generally speaking, the risk of these latter types of cancers?
I don't think anybody knows, to be honest. And you can also add lung cancer to that one on wine. A really, really strange finding, because lung cancer, as we know, is really an intractable cancer. But how wine does it, I don't think anybody knows. But the evidence is really very strong. So it is surprising. And the other cancers you've mentioned, the blood cancers, again, surprising that those are reduced, because where does alcohol go? Into the bloodstream. Why should blood cancers be reduced with this toxin in your bloodstream? It makes no sense. But the fact is that epidemiologically, it is true. Nobody knows, because actually they're not bothering to investigate. They don't want to find out because they want you not to drink. They don't want to tell you that it reduces certain cancers. So why should they investigate it?
Right. And we'll get to that nanny state patronizing kind of approach to it's just simpler to tell people not to drink versus the nuanced message of that J curve where there are some benefits in moderation, but people, of course, can't be trusted with their own adult choices. What did the Mayo Clinic, respected nonprofit US-based research and treatment center, find in its study about women and red wine?
Found it was remarkable because they looked at the French data and obviously thought to themselves, like you did, the French say they like their wine too much. And then they did a study of Californian women, pulled together of about 7 or 8 different studies in the USA on all women across the USA, all wine drinkers, and found the same thing, that there was a reduced risk of breast cancer. A slight reduced risk of, it's only a slight, nothing as big as the French, but still significant in the right direction.
And maybe, I don't know, if the French found more of an impact because of that so-called Mediterranean diet of healthy fruits and vegetables in combination with wine and not rushing your meals and less fast food, and perhaps.
More than certainly.
Je ne sais pas. But to understand what these studies are reporting and why headlines can seem so scary when in fact the data is not, I think we also need to understand absolute risk versus relative risk. Again, jump in here, correct me, Tony, if I get this mucked up, but absolute risk is the probability of something occurring in a specific group, while relative risk is the comparison of the risk happening between two groups. So I'll make up an example. If 1 person out of 100 people who does not drink wine gets cancer, the absolute risk is 1%, 1 out of 100. If 2 people out of 100 people who do drink wine get cancer, the absolute risk would be 2%, 2 people. However, the relative risk of getting cancer for those who drink, in this fabricated study, who drink wine, compared to those who do not drink wine is double, or 100%, because the number went from 1 person to 2 people. So the more dramatic seeming relative risk is often what grabs headlines versus the rather, I would say, nothing burger of absolute risk. Is that a very basic understanding of what we often see reported?
That's correct. Basically, everybody uses relative risk, particularly the pharmaceutical industry, because it amplifies the apparent benefit of their drugs. All scientific research is expressed in relative risk. I mean, I'm aware of the fact that absolute certainly reduces not only the dangers of breast cancer, for example, if you drink, but also reduces the benefits of breast cancer if you drink. So, relative increases and absolute decreases. So you've got your plus or minus a little bit, as you say, nothing burger to a certain extent. So, I mean, rather than going into that, to be honest, the book should have mentioned absolute risk all the way through, but because everybody else does relative risk, all the publications are in relative risk, all the pharmaceutical companies are in relative risk, so I thought I'd better go along with the flow and be honest about it.
Then you're comparing apples to apples. It's the currency of our headlines.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
What I found really fascinating was the connection between folate and cancer risk in wine drinkers. As background, folic acid and folate are both terms for the vitamin B9, but they differ in how they're absorbed by the body. Folate is the natural form of the vitamin B9 and occurs in certain foods such as leafy greens, citrus fruits, and beans. Folic acid is the synthetic form of B9, often found in supplements and vitamins. Alcohol depletes our natural folate, and since the body does not store folic acid or folate, it needs to be replaced daily through food or supplements. Folate deficiency is common and can lead to serious complications like anemia and birth defects. What did a Denmark study show about taking folate and cancer risk?
Well, it wasn't just Denmark. It's actually about 10 different countries have found the same thing. This is really interesting for women. As you say, folate is depleted by alcohol. And again, Harvard have done an awful lot of work on this. If you give folate to women in supplement form, women drinkers, they will reduce their risk of breast cancer massively, sometimes so to the extent of completely wiping out the risk. Now, the risk is pretty low in the first place, but in some studies, so completely zero risk. I mean, I'm not advising women, I'm simply reporting on what the evidence says. The evidence is overwhelming that if you take folate supplements, 400 micrograms a day, you will almost completely knock out your risk of breast cancer if you drink. And you see, if the health authorities really had any concern for our health, they wouldn't go on banging on about limits and so on. They'd say, if you overindulge, take folate. We don't mind if you drink, but just don't drink too much. And if you do drink too much, take some folate. And this applies to many of the cancers, the ones in the head and neck that you mentioned, also massively reduced if you take folate.
I didn't know that. Wow. And the good news is that folate is based on B and it's not fat soluble, so we don't store it, we don't overdose on it. We'll just create expensive P if we take too much. So there doesn't seem to be a downside.
I don't think you can have too much folate, to be honest.
Oh, okay. I went on the hunt. This is just a personal question, but are there any brands you recommend, or do you have a brand you take? Because it's hard to find folate versus not folic acid. Like, it is really, I had to go online. So
the one I use is American company called Solgar, S for sugar, Olgar. They have been in the business for about 40 years. See, one has to be very careful with supplements. There are a lot of con men out there pretending, that I did some work. One of the things I did for What Doctors Don't Tell You was investigating some of this. And there are only one or two companies in the world who we actually analysed all their stuff.
What was in it? Yeah. I never buy anything consumable off Amazon you never know what you're getting off the online stores.
Solgar
it's on Amazon. Oh, okay.
Yeah,
but from the Solgar store, presumably, like it's a
Solgar
direct.
Store,
Yeah, okay.
And in England, the best one is Lambert's, Lamberts, Lambert's.
I'm going to put links to those in the show notes.
But Lambert's don't do folate, unfortunately, so I don't know. So the one I buy is Solgar.
Solgar. All right, cool. We'll put that in there. I want to tackle dementia next. How might wine protect against cognitive decline and dementia, and I guess also Alzheimer's disease?
Well, the evidence is pretty strong that it does. Wine in particular. All alcohols do to a certain extent. A big Swedish study showed this, that women who drank exclusively wine had a 75% reduced risk of Alzheimer's. A lot of other studies in Denmark and also, now we know this is true because they've done work on animals, rats, mice, and they've given them lucky things. They've given them some wine to drink in there, and then unlucky things they had to be killed so they can.
But they were the happiest in the lab up to a point.
They were happy up to that point. So they researched, looked at their brains, and they found, although it's only a connection between Alzheimer's and amyloid plaques in the brain. It's not causative, but they are connected. We know that one is joined to the other, whether one causes the other, neither here nor there. But they found in the rat the amyloid plaques were reduced in the rats that drank wine. So we know there's a biological mechanism there going on. And also MRI scans have been done on human beings where the brain volume is increased in wine drinkers compared to non-wine.
Increased more neurons?
Yeah. Bigger volume.
And more synaptical connections? Okay.
All of that stuff, yeah.
Wow. Oh my goodness. So, and the plaques being what starts to gum up the brain and cause these cognitive declines. So you're getting rid of that, just like with heart disease, you're getting rid of plaque in other areas with wine. Wow, 75%. Because 2/3 of those diagnosed with dementia or Alzheimer's are women. It's an autoimmune disease. So that's really one of the few good things, I guess, the big guy in the sky designed into us. So it's protective, is it at 20 grams of alcohol, roughly speaking, for this sort of cognitive aspect?
It's about that. Yeah, 20, 25 grams.
Okay.
Yeah.
Should be a third of a bottle?
No, you call it a third of a bottle, yeah.
Yeah, a third of a bottle. Okay, cool. And what I also found striking was, I think you mentioned that alcohol also helps decrease arthritis, which is, of course, inflammation and affects women as well. It seems counterintuitive in my mind because I think of alcohol as a vasodilator. How is it reducing inflammation?
I don't know, and I don't think they do.
Okay.
But they've definitely found it. They've done X-rays of people who drink compared to X-rays of people who don't drink, and they have more of the actual inflammation showing up on the X-rays. So it's an objective effect.
Wow. Okay. We hear the headlines: lifespan, how long you live, versus health span, how well you live in the life that you have. Why do you think wine plays such an important part in the longevity puzzle for certain populations overall? Like, we've talked about the various diseases, so all of that's contributing, but is there anything else? Like, I don't know, are they just living a slower, more well-paced life because they're drinking wine and getting together with people, stress, all that sort of stuff?
I think so. I mean, it's particularly true in Mediterranean areas. Wine is an integral part of the Mediterranean diet. And as you say, lifestyle, sociability and so on also counts. But Italian researchers have told me that in their experience, wine represents 15% of the value of a Mediterranean diet. That's a lot. So in other words, I mean, they've done work on Italians who don't drink, but also Mediterranean diet to compare them. So wine is an essential part of the Mediterranean diet, and it does account for longevity.
All right. Well, liver, the one last organ we'll deal with. You mentioned that heavy wine drinkers in Italy often experienced fewer liver issues than anticipated. Can you explain what else they found? Was it genetic factors that protect this population, or is there some sort of positive impact when it comes to liver? And of course, we hear about cirrhosis when there's too much heavy drinking. Finland was another study that happened, or that found some contra. What you would expect to find?
Well, the extraordinary thing is that about 95% of drinkers, even heavy drinkers, never get liver cirrhosis. Never get it. Even alcoholics, about 13% never get it. Never. So there's something odd about the people who do get liver disease compared to the people who don't. Some kind of genetic, you say, issue there. Those of us who don't get it are lucky.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's move on to these studies that are so problematic and create these headlines. In 2023, the World Health Organization, or the WHO, declared no level of alcohol consumption is safe for our health. They didn't differentiate between different types of people, gender, or types of alcohol. They also ignored some evidence from their own researchers, I believe. You called it a de facto prohibition. What were the flaws, and why did they make this announcement, and what was the fallout?
Well, the flaws are obvious because if you read my book, you'll see the flaws were there. But I think they simply have an agenda. They have a real people-hating agenda, the WHO.
People-hating? They don't want us to have fun?
They don't, exactly. There's puritanical. It goes along with the sort of temperance movement that's all over the globe. I'm just an example. The woman who's made this point in the WHO, what she said was, the one thing we can say for sure is that the more you drink, the more harmful it is. In other words, the less you drink, the safer it is.
Well, that's contradicting herself.
Yeah. It's contradicting herself, but it's contradicting the evidence. But listen to this. This is her job description. Her name is Carina Ferreira Borges. She's program manager for alcohol, illicit drugs, and prison health. Now get that job description.
Of life.
So she obviously thinks alcohol is an illicit drug and thinks we all ought to be in prison for drinking it.
Well, there is something to be said for the fact that, obviously people in this organization, but also doctors generally see the downside of alcohol and everything else in life consistently. They don't see happy, positive people who are drinking wine in moderation and saying, hey, just checking in with you, got no issues. So it's got to affect your view of some of these things when all you see are the problems associated with it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely, which is probably why they're against it.
Right. And no fun to have at a dinner party at all.
Well, except doctors do drink a huge amount.
Right.
They do,
secretly.
generally.
Yeah, I believe it.
There's a doctors' organisation, there's a charity, it's an actual charitable concern called something like Charity for Drunken Doctors or something like that.
Wow.
It's a kind of self-help group of people. And the stories doctors, in my last book, I quoted a guy saying, I had to drink vodka because it wouldn't smell on my breath, and I couldn't drive to work anymore. I had to go by bicycle to work, and I'd end up every day in the hedge, completely rat-assed.
Okay, that's not who you want to go talk to. But then again, maybe fewer of us would lie to our doctors.
They say, what's the definition of an alcoholic? Someone who drinks more than their doctor. Let's spoil the joke. Forget it, rub it out.
No, gotcha. But yeah, I think a lot of us are loath to tell our doctors just how much we drink, how little we exercise, and all the rest of it about fruit and vegetables. But anyway, that's a whole other rabbit hole. In 2023, Ireland passed legislation to put the following warning on all alcohol labels, including wine, starting in 2026. Quote, there is a direct link between alcohol and fatal cancers, liver disease, and alcohol consumption during pregnancy. The labels will be printed in red capital letters in Times New Roman bold type on a white background. The text will occupy most of the space on the label and be positioned in the center. They'll also include information about the number of calories and grams of alcohol in the product. Why did this happen in Ireland first? Do you think other countries will follow suit?
Sadly, yes. The thing is that Ireland is being used as a test bed for lots of policies generated by the European Union and also the World Economic Forum. Both of them are in concert with each other. And Ireland being a small country and generally kind of accepting population, they are a test bed for these nonsensical ideas. I mean, they've recently had a huge influx of immigration just thrust upon them. It's again the Great Reset. You've heard of the Great Reset, haven't you?
No, I do not know the Great Reset.
Oh, the Great Reset was something that the World Economic... You've heard of the World Economic Forum?
Yeah, at Davos?
At Davos, yeah. Well, the guy who runs that is a sinister man called Klaus Schwab.
Ooh, sounds like a villain.
He is a villain. He sounds like a Bond villain. He speaks like this, and he says... He said, well, we have got so many contacts all over the world, and we have our young leaders who have come to learn our techniques of how to manipulate the population. He didn't say that, but that's what he meant. He said, we have already penetrated many cabinets, and we have half of our members in the cabinet of Canada, for example. They are a global sinister group of people who want to take over the world, and they're using Ireland as a test bed for these draconian policies like mass immigration and alcohol labelling and so on. It's all part and parcel of this UNWEF conspiracy. I hate to use the word, but there are it is conspiracy.
Well, as long as money's involved, there's always motivations, and I'll just say this is our opinion only. We are both journalists, critics. Please don't sue me, Mr. Bond villain.
He's well worse than that. He's well worse than that, let me tell you.
Okay, all right, great. I'm glad he's conditioned to whatever kind of constructive criticism he's received. You mentioned Canada, my home place as well. Felicity Carter, whom I think is one of the best wine journalists on the planet, has been writing about wine and health for years. And in an excellent article, she reported, and I'm quoting here, that in 2020, Health Canada asked the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction, the CCSA, to revamp national drinking guidelines. When their recommendations were released in January 2023, there was an immediate outcry. So controversial were the findings that people should stick to just 2 drinks per week or less, that even the anti-addiction specialists denounced them. As a result, the recommendations were never adopted. In fact, Health Canada's guidelines remain the same as they were in 2011, up to 2 drinks a day for women, 3 drinks for men, 14, 21 respectively per week. 3 of the Canadian researchers behind the failed recommendations are now involved in writing the U.S. guidelines. She further quotes Professor Dan Malik of the Department of Health Sciences at Brock University in Ontario, who wrote in the Globe and Mail newspaper, quote, although reports have suggested that the guidelines are based on nearly 6,000 peer-reviewed studies. Strict criteria ruled out all but 16 of these studies in their mathematical modeling. In other words, the CCSA based their recommendations on a relatively narrow understanding of how alcohol functions. Professor Malik ended by saying the guidelines were worse than useless or reckless. The guidelines are so divorced from reality they might drive people to ignore public health suggestions altogether. And in my opinion, it's like declaring that there's no safe level of flying. There isn't, by the way, so we should all stop flying. Not. The researchers involved had either volunteered or accepted travel or hospitality from Movendi, which is a temperance group founded in 1860, known as the International Organization of Good Templars, and they have a mandate for complete abstinence, no matter what the science says. To underscore those points, how was bias introduced into this study? So this made headlines, not just in Canada, but around the world, and obviously now it's affecting U.S. What were the problems of this? Cherry picking is probably first and foremost. They used 16 studies out of 6,000. Do you want to expand on that a little bit about the flaws and problems with this study, Tony?
Yeah, the man behind this is a man who is known to all of us in the pro-alcohol movement as the greatest scientific anti-alcohol activist of the lot. His name is Tim Stockwell. I won't give him the title of doctor, but he has a doctorate, God knows what. But he has a doctorate in very good PR as well, but a doctorate in very poor science. The study that you're talking about came out last year, and it's to do with all-cause mortality. And what he claimed to find was there was no benefit from alcohol whatsoever. But what he'd done, it was called a meta-analysis. As I mentioned earlier, a meta-analysis is meant to pull together all of the studies that have been done. You weed out the ones that are not very high quality, obviously, blah, duplications and so on. But you try and incorporate the whole lot, otherwise you get a completely distorted picture. And obviously this is what he wanted to end up with, a completely distorted picture, because what he did was the study had 3,230 studies to look at. They analysed only 107 and found, to no one's surprise, that they obviously discarded all the ones that showed that there was a longevity benefit from alcohol, and then they came up with the answer that there wasn't any. He did the same thing in 2016, looking at heart disease. Again, alcohol and heart disease, there were 2,662 studies. He chose only 6 to look at. And he came to the conclusion that one should be sceptical about the benefits of heart disease with alcohol. I think we should be sceptical about the benefits of Mr. Stockwell, frankly.
Absolutely. It's not just cherry picking. There is no fresh or new research. He was just analyzing and then cherry picking. No original research there. And no wonder Health Canada rejected the recommendations. It's kind of scary, though, that now he's, I guess, one of the 3 who's advising the U.S. on revised guidelines.
US was actually really very good until 2016. They had a recommendation to drink up to 28 grams of alcohol a day, which is a quarter of a bottle of wine a day. They had a recommendation said it should, as the part of a healthy diet should be to avoid crap food and eat lots of fruits and vegetables, but also have a moderate intake of alcohol. And they specified 28 grams a day, which is very moderate, but obviously it's in the right direction. And then that was in 2016, and then in 2020 they got someone new on the board who didn't recommend drinking alcohol. They took that bit out. They didn't actually say don't drink it. They just said we won't recommend it as part of a healthy diet. And then now it's going to get even worse. The whole thing is utterly corrupt. It's all politicized. It's not science. It's pseudoscience. It's joke science. It's an insult.
Who's benefiting?
It's an insult to our health.
Intelligence, too.
And our intelligence. An insult to the evidence.
Absolutely. Science is science. Who's benefiting? Again, where's the money? Who's getting something out of this?
Well, I think it's the temperance movement. I don't think there's any money involved. I know it is normally money, but it's also politics as well, Iraq wars and all that stuff. But I think there's a general anti-having fun movement. They don't want us to fly anymore because it, apparently causes global warming, which is actually bloody nonsense. Everything that they want to do to us, and I mean do to us, not for us, to us. It's to prevent us enjoying ourselves, having fun, traveling anywhere, just having an enjoyable life. They want to control it, so the elites can fly in their private jets and drink as much alcohol as they want, and then look down on the rest of us poor serfs who aren't allowed to have any fun at all. I do think it's as simple as that. It's a new prohibition. It's a new Puritanism. I'm sorry.
Right. Well, it is a way of taking power by implementing guidelines or regulations or laws that dive deeper and deeper into people's lives. I mean, if you've chosen a career that is not about money, like you're not in the private sector, I'm grossly generalizing, then maybe it is about what change can you make. And even if you're thinking that it is good for people, it does seem to be about power, the whole nanny state, as you call it, with these guidelines and trying to push them in.
I think the other problem is that they find the idea of the J curve very difficult to understand. They think people will find it very difficult to understand. So they think if we tell people that a little bit of alcohol is good for you, then they'll go obviously and think, oh, a whole lot of this is good for you. But you see, if there would be much more nuance than that, we're not stupid. As you said earlier, we know that too much water will kill you, too much running or exercise will kill you. Too little will kill you. There are lots of J curves in all of life. Life is full of J curves.
Yeah. Life's complex, and that makes it a good thing, not a bad thing. And then the risk is the public stops listening to guidelines that could be good for them if they made sense. So we stop trusting.
The British guidelines were quite good until 2016, but they were actually drawn up by a team of civil servants who had in fact done exactly the same thing as I had done, had gone to the British Medical Library, the biggest one in London, and done exactly what I did, looked at all the data. They were surprised at what they found, and they came up with the idea with recommending 4 units a day for men and half that for women. Now, that was about 28 grams of alcohol a day. Now, that was a very sensible, they didn't recommend, they said don't go above that. But actually, that was the optimum dose for maximum health, because I knew people wouldn't listen to it anyway otherwise, but it was very, very sensible. And then 4 or 5 years later, the medics came in and halved all that and then said, wine is an old wives' tale, all that kind of stuff. So it's a slippery slope we're going down, and we ought to fight it. Fight it!
Yes, exactly. It's enough to drive you to drink.
I want to say to your viewers, you are seeing a very red-faced man in front of you. I'm not red-faced because I'm angry. I'm red-faced because I've just come back from a week in Greece, lying in the sun.
You look tanned, not red. You look tanned. You look healthy. You look Mediterranean healthy.
I think I've had too much. I've had over on the wrong side of the J curve of sun.
You've stored up some good polyphenols there.
Oh, good vitamin D, yeah.
It's all good.
Don't think I'm some kind of mad old fart,
No, you've done the science, you've done the work. What's next for you, Tony, in terms of, are you going to do another book or something on wine and health or alcohol, or are you moving on to different areas? What's your next project?
I'm never one to sort of let the tide wash around my feet. I think I've done wine and alcohol, but if they keep on going down this route, I'm going to do a really, really big number on them, and I've got a new title for it and so on.
New book, yeah.
But I've got 1 or 2 other things where again the authorities have lied through their teeth. And before I die, I've got 2 more books to do, and then I shall die a happy man.
That's great. With a perfect heart and everything else, you'll just, when you're 120. As we wrap up our conversation, is there anything we haven't covered that you'd like to cover? Or are you completely exhausted by this?
You've done very well. Anyway. No, thank you so much for inviting me. And as I say, I do apologise to my readers for looking like a...
Oh, not at all. And on the podcast, they really won't know.
Well, okay, wind down the gain on the red button.
Yes, we'll put the filter on you. How can people find you online, you and your books, Tony?
I don't have a website. Can't see the point. Mr. Amazon does that for me, as it were. He prints my book. I think Jeff Bezos, what he's done, I don't approve of his politics one bit, but, as a man who's allowed, I tried to get publishers to take my book, my first book. No one was interested.
Too counterintuitive.
Too controversial. So I had to self-publish it. And Jeff Bezos doesn't censor self-published books, as far as I can see. I'm really, I am thankful to the man. And the fact is, it's very cheap to write a book on his print-on-demand system. There's
It
no
is.
upfront capital cost. And so he's done a wonderful job for people like me getting truth out to the public so the public can hear the truth.
Absolutely. And there's more and more self-publishing these days. It's not however we might have been snobby about it in the past.
The vanity publishing.
It's not vanity publishing, because I've published 3 books with Penguin Random House. But, my next one, I am considering going the self-publishing route, because this is going down another rabbit hole, but there's no more money in publishing. I mean, the advances and everything else, and you do all the work anyway. So I think there are a lot of smart entrepreneurs now publishing their own books. Why not take 90% of the revenue versus 10%? You're going to do the same amount of work anyway. So we can find the very good news about wine and the good news about booze, both of which are on Amazon and perhaps other online retailers, but Amazon's probably the easiest one where we can find your books. Tony, thank you so much. This has been terrific. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I know listeners are going to love this. We covered all a lot of the bases. There's still lots more in your book, I should say. It's definitely don't think you've had enough by just listening to this episode or 2 here. So do go get the books. But thank you, Tony. I appreciate this.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you asking me, of course.
All right. Cheers.
Cheers.
Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed our chat with Tony. Here are my takeaways. Number 1, what might surprise you about the impact of alcohol on heart disease? As Tony observes, Harvard has a big center of research, and they have conducted research in Framingham, Massachusetts. They started just after the Second World War to recruit the population of this small town and study their medical records in detail. It's a long-term project, still going on 50 years later, and they discovered that people who drink alcohol definitively have less heart disease. Number 2, how can wine drinkers reduce the risk of certain cancers with one supplement? Folate is depleted by alcohol, Tony explains. Harvard researchers discovered that if you give women folate in supplement form, women drinkers will reduce their risk of breast cancer massively, to the extent of wiping out the risk. The risk, he says, is low in the first place. The evidence is overwhelming that if you take folate supplements, 400 micrograms a day, you will almost completely knock out your risk of breast cancer if you drink. This also applies to many other cancers, such as those of the head and neck. They are massively reduced if you take folate, he says. And just let me say one more time that neither Tony nor I are doctors, so this isn't medical advice. We are just sharing what the research has said. Number 3, does wine help protect against cognitive decline and dementia? The evidence is pretty strong that it does, Tony notes. Wine in particular, according to a large Swedish study, showed that women who drank wine exclusively had a 75% reduced risk of Alzheimer's. We know this is true because they've done the work on animals, and their research looked at their brains and found, although it's only a connection between Alzheimer's and amyloid plaques in the brain, it's not causative. They are connected, though. Amyloid plaques were reduced in rats who drank wine, so we know there's a biological mechanism going on. And also MRI scans have been done on human beings where brain volume has increased in wine drinkers. And number 4, why do some organizations make extreme recommendations for eliminating alcohol consumption completely, despite the research showing otherwise in terms of its benefits? Tony thinks the problem is that they find the idea of the J-curve very difficult to explain. They think people will find it difficult to understand. So they believe that if they tell people that a little bit of alcohol is good for you, we'll all drink too much. We're not stupid, though, as Tony notes. We know that too much water can kill you, too much exercise can kill you, and too little can kill you as well. There are a lot of J-curves in life, throughout life. Life is a J-curve. In the show notes, you'll find the full transcript of my conversation with Tony, links to his website and book, the video versions of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live, and where you can order my book online now, no matter where you live. If you missed episode 151, go back and take a listen. I chat about natural wines with Rachel Signer. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite.
Standardization has actually taken the place of tradition. That is the debate raging around these appellations and winemakers who are kicked out. For a lot of natural winemakers, it's insulting to be told that because they don't add things to their wines, they're not going to have the place name on their label. We often don't go through the channels, the court of master somms, and here we are. Some people don't like the way that they taste, quite honestly. I don't think that everyone needs to like natural wine. I do think there are a lot of very classical tasting natural wines that don't get enough attention. I think there is a natural wine for everyone.
You won't want to miss next week when we chat with Johannes Fresnelli, physician and professor of human anatomy at the University of Quebec at Trois-Rivières, focusing on the physiology, psychology, and pathology of the sense of smell, and particularly how that relates to wine. If you liked this episode or learned even one thing from it, please email or tell a friend about the podcast this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in learning more about the surprising health benefits and risks of wine. It's easy to find my podcast. Just tell them to search Natalie McLean Wine on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, their favorite podcast app, or they can listen to the show on my website at nataliemclean.com/podcast. Email me if you have a sip tip question, or if you'd like to win a copy of Tony's book or Gus's. I have 4 copies in total to give away, or if you've read my book or are listening to it. I'd love to hear your thoughts about wine and health. Did this episode help your understanding of the issues? Were you surprised about anything? Do you disagree with some of the points we discussed? Email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com. In the show notes, you'll also find a link to take a free online food and wine pairing class with me called The 5 Wine and Food Pairing Mistakes That Can Ruin Your Dinner and How to Fix Them Forever at nataliemclean.com/class. That's all in the show notes at nataliemclean.com/310. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week. Perhaps a wine that is close to and good for your heart. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So subscribe for free now at nataliemclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.